Thank you for coming. We're gonna make some history together today.
They said he was like a god.
First there was Jesus and then there was Steve.
This guy has something.
He's like glowing and on fire, and I was just like,
He had something stronger than charisma. He had a
Reality Distortion.
Reality Distortion.
The Reality Distortion Field.
And it drove people crazy.
You could go to people and ask them to do something that they thought was impossible.
That's how he built Apple and introduced amazing products like
The iPad, the new iMac, the iPod, iPhoto, MacBook Air, iTunes, iPhone.
It's how he founded Pixar, behind movies like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, and of course, Inside Out. Some people say that Steve Jobs was a genius.
He's a maniacal genius.
Others say that he's a liar, a manipulator, a cult leader.
He's seducing you, vilifying you.
He traded so many people so badly.
It becomes very Godfather-esque. If you choose to leave my family, I will personally take you down.
But nobody knows the truth behind his reality distortion field. Welcome to Jumpstart Your Career. I'm your host Gary, and this is the untold story of Steve Jobs' most powerful weapon. The year was 1966, and a 13-year-old boy named Bud Tripple was watching the TV show Star Trek, the original series. In that episode called The Menagerie, the Star Trek crew encountered a telepathic race of aliens called the Talosians. The Talosians had these super cool telepathic powers. They could bend reality with the sheer force of their will. Using that power, they wreaked havoc. At the time, Bud thought nothing of it. A superpower that allows you to brainwash people and bend reality? That is so ridiculous. No wonder it's science fiction. 14 years later, Bud joined a computer company called Apple Computers. At Apple, he had a boss named Steve Jobs. Steve was only 25 years old at the time, but he was so charismatic. He had the gravitational pull of the sun. When you're around him, you can't help but feel inspired, crazy, and energized. One moment, you're grounded in reality, but the next, you're flying in his vision.
Most places in life are continuously telling you that your dreams aren't possible or practical. You don't want to hear that when you're under 30. What you want to do is race after them.
He's almost like those weird aliens in Star Trek that could bend reality. When he made that connection, Bud gave it a name: the Reality Distortion Field. It's a term that would follow Steve Jobs throughout his entire life and be a part of his legacy. Even Bill Gates talked about how Steve Jobs was like a wizard.
He would be casting spells and I would see people mesmerized. I was like, wait a minute, that spell should not work at all. It doesn't have any reality to it.
But where does Steve Jobs get this power from? To really understand his reality distortion field, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Before he was a tech visionary, Steve Jobs was abandoned. His birth parents were 23, unmarried, and came from different religious backgrounds, so they decided to give him away.
My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption.
He was adopted by a couple named Paul and Clara Jobs, who raised him in Silicon Valley. According to his best-selling biography by Walter Isaacson, Steve had a vivid memory of when he was 6 or 7 years old. At that time, he already knew that he was adopted, but he didn't think much about it until one afternoon. He remembered sitting on the front lawn of his house and talking to a girl who lived across the street.
I remember right here on the lawn telling Lisa McMorley, who lived across the street, that I was adopted. And she said, "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" Ooh, lightning bolt in my eye. I remember running into the house. I think I started crying, asking my parents, and they sat me down. They said, "No, you don't understand." They said, "We specifically picked you."
In many ways, this was Steve Jobs' villain origin story. He began questioning, who even am I? Why did my birth parents reject me? According to psychologists, many adopted children face what is now known as an identity crisis, where they question who they are and how they belong in this world. When you don't even know who your real parents, aka the people responsible for your genetics and your DNA are, it can be hard to know where you fit into this world. That's something that Steve Jobs really struggled with over the years.
Even when I first met Steve, the fact that he was given up for adoption was a huge emotional issue in his life.
He was abandoned and yet chosen at the same time. And from that paradox, he formed a belief. He was different. That feeling began to solidify when Steve Jobs entered school. He was smart, so smart that the teachers even had him tested. It turns out, in 4th grade, he was already testing at the high school sophomore level. Intellectually, he's light years ahead of his peers. Being intellectually superior built his confidence. It also gave him a rule-breaking mindset. Normal rules and expectations that apply to other people don't apply to him. And thus, he became a rebel. From a young age, Steve Jobs questioned everything. Unlike most kids, he doesn't simply believe what he's told. In school, he never listened to his teachers, and in college, he dropped out after just 1 semester. At age 13, he stopped attending church. The story goes like this. In 1968, Life magazine printed an issue showcasing 2 starving children from the Biafra War. When Steve saw this, he was disturbed. So he brought the magazine to church and showed it to the pastor and asked him,
"Does God know about this and what's going to happen to these children?"
The pastor was like,
"Steve, I know you don't understand, but yes, God knows about that."
Afterwards, Steve Jobs decided that he no longer wants to worship such a God and stopped attending church. From that point on, he rejected blind faith in religion, in authority, or even traditions. He didn't follow society's rules. He made his own rules. In high school, Steve began experimenting with drugs. It started with marijuana at 15, but by senior year, he was taking LSD. LSD stands for lysergic acid diethylamide. It's a hallucinogen that can completely alter your perception of reality. It distorts your senses, warps your sense of time. You might feel euphoric or panic. You might feel like you've left your body. Some people call it ego death. Over the years, many tech titans like Sam Altman, Sergey Brin, and Elon Musk have spoken out about the benefits of psychedelics. And Steve Jobs once said that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things I've done in my life. Here's what Daniel Kotke, who used to do LSD with Steve Jobs in college, had to say about this topic.
You said that Steve had said that LSD was kind of one of the best things he ever did. Why was that?
It expands your consciousness. It could have been mushrooms. It could have been peyote. It could have been any number of other things. Conversely, Steve was never really interested in smoking pot. That did not expand consciousness.
LSD showed Steve that reality is malleable. But it wasn't until college that he truly understood and mastered the reality distortion field. In fact, he met 2 mentors that helped him find the way. In September 1972, Steve Jobs arrived at Reed College, a small private liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon. He was 17, shy, and a pretty private person. And then he met Robert Friedland. Robert was everything that Steve was not. He was 4 years older, the student body president, and just came out of prison for selling LSD. He was outgoing, charismatic, and had a strong aura. When Robert walked into a room, everyone noticed. Years later, Robert would become a billionaire in the mining industry. But back then, he was a hippie who was interested in Eastern spirituality and Steve Jobs' friend. And they were really close. In fact, Daniel Kotke, who we just talked about earlier, believed that Robert Friedland was the one who taught Steve Jobs the reality distortion field. Because after hanging out with Robert, Steve Jobs became a different person. He came out of his shell and became more outgoing and charismatic. He learned how to command a room and grab attention. And slowly, that awkward teenager started becoming Steve Jobs. Fun fact, Robert had a rich uncle who owned an apple farm, and he was in charge of running it. Steve Jobs would often drive up and work there on the weekends, where he was in charge of pruning the apple trees at the apple farm. And that's where the name Apple Computers came from. In February 1974, Steve Jobs dropped out of Reed College. He returned home and showed up barefoot at Atari, a video game manufacturer, and somehow landed a job there. Atari had developed some of the most iconic games in the 60s and 70s, such as Pong. And the founder is a man named Nolan Bushnell. He was charismatic, a visionary entrepreneur, and also had his own reality distortion field. Nolan and Steve hit it off right away. They had very similar personalities, and Nolan saw something in this scrappy 19-year-old.
I really appreciated his intensity. He had one speed, full on.
Steve learned a lot from Nolan. He learned to use charisma to lead, to bend the rules and get results, and to push people to achieve greatness. But the most important things he learned from Nolan was a mindset. If you act like you can do something, then it will work. Pretend to be completely in control, and people will assume you are. However, the most fundamental transformation for Steve Jobs happened in 1974 when he visited India. At the time, he had 3 goals: find a guru, obtain spiritual enlightenment, and understand his place in the world. But India wasn't what he expected. As soon as he landed in New Delhi, things fell apart. He accidentally drank unfiltered water and got dysentery, which is a type of gastrointestinal infection, and he lost 40 pounds in 1 week. He had a high fever, bloody diarrhea, and thought he was literally gonna die. But once he recovered, he kept going. He traveled barefoot through villages, met Hindu holy men, meditated under trees, and somewhere in that 7-month journey, something changed. Steve Jobs was raised in Silicon Valley, the land of logic, semiconductors, and business plans. But in the villages of India, he learned a different operating system: prajna. Prajna is a Buddhist term that often translates to wisdom or insight. Pra means higher or supreme, and jna means knowledge or understanding. It's a deep, intuitive form of wisdom, something that you can only get through silences, meditation, and life experiences. Years later, Steve Jobs reflected upon this experience. The people in the Indian countryside don't use their intellect like we do. They use their intuition instead. Intuition is a very powerful thing, more powerful than intellect in my opinion. That was the final ingredient of the reality distortion field. It wasn't intellect or charisma, it was intuition. Steve left India with no money, no degree, and no plan. But he did gain something: a different way of looking at the world. And now, it's time to use them. And there are 3 main ways that Steve used it: warping deadlines, product features, and SteveNotes. One of the most impressive examples of his reality distortion field is his ability to bend time. And a famous example is the iPhone. In 2005, Apple was developing the first ever iPhone. It had a plastic screen, just like the iPod did. But when Steve saw it, he was horrified. It looks cheap, and it scratches. Instead, he wants to use a glass screen that is sleek, premium, and scratch resistant. There was just one problem. No such glass existed, and they were only a few months away from launch. That's when Steve was connected to a man named Wendell Weeks, the CEO of Corning, a large glass manufacturer. Surprisingly, Wendell had the perfect solution. Back in the 1960s, Corning had developed an experimental material called Gorilla Glass. It was thin, light, and incredibly strong. However, they never found the right market, so Corning stopped producing it. At first, Steve thought, this is way too good to be true. I don't think Gorilla Glass is strong enough. And then he started explaining the science behind making glass to Wendell, the CEO of a company that makes glass. Wendell literally cut him off and said, "Can you shut up and let me teach you some science?" Steve was silenced. Wendell then proceeded to explain the science behind how they make Gorilla Glass and the chemical strengthening process that they use to make it so durable. After hearing this, Steve Jobs paused. And then he said, "I want as much Gorilla Glass as you guys can possibly make in 6 months." Wendell was stunned. He said, 6 months? That's impossible. None of our factories are currently making Gorilla Glass. That's when Steve Jobs released his reality distortion field. He looked Wendell in the eye and said, "Don't be afraid. Get your mind around it. You can do it." And somehow, Wendell did it. Overnight, they shifted their entire business model. They put their best scientists and engineers on this project. They only had 6 weeks to modify their existing Gorilla Glass to make it lighter, thinner, and more see-through. Then, they converted all of their factories from making LCD displays to making Gorilla Glass full-time. And in the end, they delivered the Gorilla Glass, just in time for the iPhone launch. They pulled off a miracle. Today, Gorilla Glass is used everywhere, not just at Apple, but at Samsung, Google Pixel, Huawei, and so many other companies. And Steve Jobs was the one who started it all. The second use case of the reality distortion field is to push people to make the greatest product that the world has ever seen. In the 1980s, Apple was building the original Macintosh, the ancestor of every MacBook and iMac that we know today. Back in the 1980s, computers were very slow. It could take a couple of minutes just for it to boot up. One afternoon, Steve Jobs confronted Larry Kenyon, the engineer responsible for the Macintosh boot up time. The Macintosh boots too slowly. You've got to make it faster. Larry started explaining all the technical challenges and why it couldn't be done, but Steve interrupted him. How many people do you think are going to be using the Macintosh? In a few years, I bet 5 million. If you can shave 10 seconds off of the boot up time and you multiply that across 5 million people, that's 50 million seconds in just one day. And over the course of a year, that's dozens of lifetimes. So if you can make the Macintosh boot 10 seconds faster, you've saved a dozen lives. And suddenly, Larry saw it differently. A few weeks later, he returned, and the Macintosh booted up way faster. Not just 10 seconds faster, but 28 seconds faster. As former Apple employee Bill Atkinson have said, Steve always had a way of motivating us by looking at the bigger picture.
You just had to spend a few minutes with him and you knew it. He had the ability to talk about the possibility of what this computer could be. So he gives people this feeling of forward movement.
In this case, he made Larry believe that he was saving lives and changing the world for the better, not an overworked and underpaid 9-to-5 corporate employee that can be easily replaced. And that's the approach that he used for everyone on the Macintosh team. They're not just mere programmers or designers. They're artists, and they want to make the greatest product in the world.
And everybody just wanted to work, not because it was work had to be done, but it was because something that we really believed in that was just going to really make a difference.
You ask yourself, why are you doing it? I'm certainly not doing it for Steve Jobs. I'm doing it for something that I think is a much greater good than that. And that's the chance to change something really, honestly, truly, for the better.
The third and flashiest use case of the reality distortion field is SteveNotes. A SteveNote isn't just a product launch. It's theater. Everyone knows that Steve Jobs always wears his black turtleneck, Levi jeans, and New Balance sneakers. But few people know how much time, effort, and planning goes into each of these keynote presentations.
I think Jobs was always a storyteller. There was always this sense that he was constructing a persona.
Steve treated every keynote like a Broadway production. He obsessed over the pacing, the lighting, the typography of each slide, and he would rehearse for weeks, refining every word, pause, and dramatic beat. According to former Apple employees, Steve Jobs would rehearse hundreds of times before a keynote and tweak the smallest details, like the way that he holds the clicker. Over the years, he's mesmerized the world many times on that stage. In 1984, he introduced the first ever Macintosh computer and played an ad that's inspired by George Orwell's 1984.
We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
In 2001, he released the first ever iPod.
This amazing little device holds 1,000 songs, and it goes right in my pocket.
In 2007, he launched the first iPhone.
This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
And just a year later, the MacBook Air.
Let me take it out here. This is the new MacBook Air.
According to former Apple CEO John Sculley, Steve Jobs seemed more like a showman than a businessman. Every move seems calculated, as if it was rehearsed, to create an occasion of the moment. When you're watching a SteveNote, you feel like you're not watching a product launch. You feel like you're witnessing history. And that's the power of the reality distortion field. Over the years, using the reality distortion field, Steve Jobs has become arguably the most successful and iconic entrepreneur of his generation. But the truth is, he's not the only person with the reality distortion field. In fact, once you become familiar with the concept, you start to see it everywhere in life. You see it in tech. The Financial Times have used it to describe Elon Musk. Adam Neumann, the co-founder of WeWork, also has it. Investors often say that when you're in his presence, you feel like you're under a spell.
There's an energy that you feel. That energy is something that's hard to explain. It's something that either you feel it or you don't.
You see it in politics. Former President Bill Clinton was known for his magnetic presence. When he looked you in the eye, it feels like you're the only two people in the room. And Donald Trump, say what you will, but his ability to bend facts, dominate headlines, and make the impossible feel inevitable is textbook reality distortion field. You see it in entertainment. Artists like Taylor Swift reshape culture conversations with every album drop, leaving critics and fans feeling like they've entered her world. So it's important to realize that the reality distortion field is not reserved for top CEOs, presidents, or celebrities. Anybody can have it. If you can think of anyone else that might have a reality distortion field, drop it in the comments and we can chat about it. Okay, we've made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. This is literally my first time making a deep dive video like this one, so let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this one, I have one more video coming about Steve Jobs, so make sure to click that subscribe button. But before I go, I want to show you guys one more clip. This is arguably my favorite thing that Steve Jobs has ever said, and I think it really captures the essence of this video.
Once you discover one simple fact, and that is everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you. The minute that you understand that you can poke life, you push in, something will pop out the other side. You can change it, you can mold it, you can build your own things that other people can use. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again.